Good morning. I hope you all had a happy Easter, happy holidays. We're just going to do one last video on Joseph Stalin because we need to determine what was actually his crimes. What were his crimes that he perpetrated? Because he is known as one of the worst butchers of the 20th century. Stalin, of course, we've already talked about this, incredibly paranoid. He made people disappear, and this was the hallmark of Stalin. He not only took his enemies and made them disappear or sent them to the gulag, he also wiped them from existence. So he would, of course, they would not exist as human beings anymore. However, he did do some things that were unique to Stalin, and that is he insisted in some of his enemies to have show trials. So he'd actually put these enemies of the people, or enemies, Trotskyites, or whatever you want to call them, up on the stand and force confessions, then execute them. It was very strange. Why not just execute them? But it was something in Stalin. He needed to have them confess to fake crimes. Of course, they'd be tortured first. They would get promises that their family would be spared. In many cases, the family, of course, was not spared. They would either be executed or sent to the gulag in Siberia. The gulag system was vast and extensive as the concentration camp system was in Nazi Germany. They were all over. Winter was, of course, frigid cold, and many people died of starvation and exposure. However, his method of getting these confessions or rooting out these so-called evil aspects of the communist regime were very sinister, and he always had help with the KGB, or as it was called back in the day, the NKVD. And these people, his little henchmen, went around and, of course, tortured, got these confessions out of people. And the most famous is Lavrentiy Beria. And Beria is very interesting because he was a Georgian as well, just like Stalin, and he gave everyone the creeps. He was just a twisted man. In fact, Stalin would introduce Beria to Roosevelt and people around the world as, "This is my Himmler," right? And he really was. In fact, Himmler, as we know from our studies in the Holocaust, was very squeamish around blood, not Beria. Beria, in fact, conducted many of the executions and tortures himself. And he thoroughly enjoyed it. He also had a penchant for exploiting people, and especially young girls. He would have them picked up, brought to his apartment, and it's a tragic, awful story. He would say to the girl, "These flowers are yours if you submit to me, but if you don't, we'll put them on your grave next week." Can you imagine? So this guy is really one of the worst people in the 20th century. And together, they had a reign of terror like the world has never seen in the 1930s. It's interesting, too, during the Second World War, Hitler, of course, reinvades Poland and Russia in 1941, and they come across these mass graves. Thousands and thousands of Polish officers are shot and executed and buried in these shallow graves. And of course, the Nazis reported to the world that Stalin's people have done this. And of course, Stalin says, "You're going to believe that?" No, it's the Nazis, of course. But we know now that, in fact, Stalin ordered the mass executions of thousands of Polish officers and enlisted men and intellectuals when he invaded the eastern half of Poland. So it's just an awful, awful era of history. But what we're here today really to learn about is the Holodomor. And the Holodomor, it really ranks second or third among the 20th century's worst genocide. In terms of numbers, no one really knows the exact numbers. They think it's about 10 million. 10 million, 8 to 10 million is kind of the accepted number. And basically, it was a forced starvation. And a lot of people say, well, it's not really a genocide because you're not bringing people to camps, but it really was. It truly was a genocide because you are depriving people of food and necessities of life. And Ukraine happens to be the bread belt of the Soviet Union at that time. This is where everyone got their grain. This is where everyone got their bread. But Stalin needed that grain to pay for his industrial projects. So Stalin basically takes all the grain from the people, searches people's houses. So he sends these armed brigades into villages and basically says, let me into your kitchen. Do you have any hidden grain? And he takes all the grain, all the food from people's homes. They literally starved to death, 10 million in the early 30s. And the world can't really believe this. Even people in the Soviet Union, they questioned Stalin and said, Stalin, is there something going on in Ukraine? Oh, no, 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 it's all fake news, fake news. So he denied it. Even his wife, Nadia, was very suspicious of this starvation and would ask Stalin about it. And of course, he would say, oh, no, no, don't believe that, don't believe that. She would end up killing herself in the early 30s as well, partly because of the friction, the tension that this created in their relationship, because of course she believed he was betraying the revolution. And he really was. He wanted to break the backs of the Ukrainians. He felt them too nationalistic, and he needed their grain. So, of course, he rounded up all the kulaks, but he also requisitioned the food from these people. He would actually have machine guns trained on farm workers, and if they were to steal grain while working on the farm, he would have them shot. There's a story of two little boys who had to go to the bathroom, so they were peeing in the grain. They were also taken out and shot. This was a crazy time. And who were these armed brigades? In many cases, the communists would come to these villages, and maybe the people that had an axe to grind, maybe the drunks of the village, they would give them a gun and say, you're in charge. Well, they settled a lot of scores that way. So it is called the Holodomor. It's one of the most unknown genocides in the 20th century, 10 million Ukrainians. And to this day, it's not really talked about. 10 million people died of mass starvation. Genocide class, I'm glad you're learning about this. It's in your user guide. Make sure you read up about it. There are documentaries on YouTube. I've put a YouTube documentary, basically not a documentary, but a little show on the Holodomor, the new memorial, since you're all doing memorials and spoken words, that's in Toronto. That was just unveiled at the anniversary of the Holodomor. Remember, don't panic, study hard, and be well.